Today in this video we're going to be taking a look at how to create this super cool rock smash animation. In Blender the only thing that I have set up is this cube with a texture applied to it. So the only thing I did was go into edit mode and front on just U and project from view because we don't really need to see the sides or anything like that, and made sure that the edges are inside of the camera so that we're not looking outside of that texture and we can get as much resolution as possible packed into that small space that we're going to be seeing. So that's all I've done to set us up. Really I want to get through the animation part and not bog you down with the boring details, so I'm trying to skip around like that. Right now I just have this text and it's a regular text object that we can edit like that. And so I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D and then move it to another layer, just in case we need to make changes. We always have a backup that we have saved. Then I'm going to save my scene just in case. And then now we can get started. So the first thing we need to do is convert this text object to a mesh object. And I'm actually going to move this to the second layer so that we can work on it without being distracted by the wall. So now under this text panel here, we can go down to extrude and extrude that out like so. And then we can press Alt-C, and what that's going to do is convert mesh from the text. So now we can go and edit this as a mesh object, and you'll notice that our geometry and topology is really messy. And that's okay because we're just going to be fracturing the object. We don't really need clean topology. But one thing that we do need is to make sure that it's completely watertight or manifold. So the way to do that is to select everything with A, hit W, and remove doubles, and that's going to remove any overlapping vertices. So that way our mesh is going to fracture nicely, and we want to make sure that it lines up with the wall. So let's pull it in just like that. And then we can take this wall over in the modifiers, we can add a boolean modifier, choose difference, and select that text. So we choose difference because we want everything but that, so we're kind of subtracting it or taking the difference. And then when we hide that text, we see we have a nice hole punched into the wall, and our UVs are completely intact, which is super cool. So I can go ahead and apply that boolean modifier, and then go to this layer here, which has this text, and we can go ahead and fracture this. So cell fracture is an add-on. If you don't have it enabled already, you can go to File, User Preferences. Under Add-ons, just search for Cell, check that box right there, and you'll be good to go. If you're not familiar with it, you can look back at some of my older tutorials. I have quite a few that cover cell fracture, so I'm not going to go over it extensively in this video. However, we are going to use it to fracture this object. So under Tools, we can just go down to Cell Fracture, and it'll bring up this pop-up box. And I'm going to fracture this object based on its own vertices. Because remember that it was kind of messy and those vertices were everywhere, and in that case it's actually going to help us give us a little bit more natural result as we're fracturing. So it's going to place those sort of chunks where those vertices are. And then I'm going to set the source limit to, say, 350. I think it's by default 100. And I'm going to add a little bit of noise just to make things a little bit more natural, and that's the only thing I'm going to change. So I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to take a second and fracture this object. Once that's done, we can see the result on the next layer, and each of these are its own individual object. And the big trick here is that we need to UV map all of these shards to match exactly what that wall is. And the really easy way to do this is just to select everything, make sure one of them is the active object, and just press Ctrl-J. And that's going to allow us to join these all into one object. So now the tricky part to UV unwrap this, I'm going to give it the same material that is the wall, and I'm going to jump into a place where I have a UV image editor, and I can go into edit mode, and in front view, I'm just going to select everything, U, and project from view. And that way I can see exactly where it is and scale it accordingly. Now the problem with this is that we have to match it up exactly to where the wall is, and that might get a little tricky because you don't want it to be off at all. But one really easy way to do this is just to select this wall, and then you can press D for using the grease pencil, or if you hold down D, you can use the grease pencil. And so I'm just going to draw a line at the bottom there, and at the side, and at the top. Then over here, I'm going to do the same thing while holding down D to draw, and I can right-click to erase if I make a mistake. So now I know exactly where that is. So when I go back to this fractured object, those lines are still going to be there, and I can select these UV coordinates, scale them up, and match them exactly where they need to be. And I can double check this view on the side to make sure that I have it 100% correct. So very quickly we can have them blend in seamlessly, and we can't even see the difference right there. So there we go. Now we can just take this object that is full of fractures, go into edit mode, and since we removed all of the doubles earlier, we can just select everything with A, hit P and separate by loose parts. That might take a second because there's quite a few of them, but once that's done we can go back into object mode, and all of these are now back to individual objects, and they each have their UVs intact. So I didn't really bother to unwrap the sides because we're not really going to be seeing them too much because of motion blur and such, but if you'd like to, you definitely can unwrap those or use generated texture coordinates to do that. Since we're going to be converting all of this to a rigid body object, each of these need to have their own origin point because it's going to have the center of mass at that origin point when we add them to a rigid body. So let's just go to set origin and origin to center of mass, and it's going to recenter all of those. So that's all great. We can select all of them, make sure one of them is the active object, then in the physics panel right there, we can add active, and now when we play this back, it is now an active rigid body, which is very cool. So it's all working well. However, under the physics panel, we can choose enable deactivation and start deactivated so that they don't blow up right away, because we want to be able to time that ourselves. So then I can press copy from active, and when we play this back, nothing's going to happen until another rigid body smashes into these. Now, one thing that I want to be able to do is separate out the timing. I might want to separate it out so one letter blows up, then the next one, then the next one, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to have the whole first word animated first, and then the second one. So the way I can do this is I'm going to go into wireframe mode and just select this whole second word, make sure one of those is the active object by selecting it, then choose the next collision group and choose copy from active. And that way they're going to be on, you can think of them as collision layers, so that one is not going to influence the other. Now we can add the timing if we want. So I'm just going to add a cube, and this is going to smash into these guys. I'll scale it along the X, and let's say we want it to smash in at about frame 25. So let's go to frame 25. I'll move it back a little bit so it has a little bit of momentum. I'll press I, insert location keyframe, and then in frame, let's say 35, I'm going to move it forward so it's just touching like that. I and insert location keyframe. Now in the physics panel, I can make that a rigid body as well, but I can choose passive and animated, and that way it's not going to act like an active rigid body and fall over. It's going to use that animation that we just set. So now if I play this back, it'll wait till that frame, go forward, and then smash hit and hit it. So it looks like it's not impacting quite as much as I'd like, so I'm going to move this a little bit forward on frame 35, and then just press I, insert that location keyframe, and now when we play this back, it should have a little bit more force and sort of pop those out nicely. And as you can see, it's not influencing the second object there because it's on the first collision layer. So now to create the second smash, I can just duplicate this on the x-axis, scale that down on the x, move that over, and on the frame that this one hit, say frame 35, I'm going to press I to insert a location keyframe there, and then back on this first one, I can press Alt-I and delete that keyframe. So now it's going to start there, and let's see, I think it took the first one from 25 to 35, so let's take this one from 35 to 45. I can move that up to match the second one. Insert location. And I can move this to the second collision group. Then when we play this back, we have first one hit, second one hit, and we're all good. And we can see that if we enable this first layer, and change this to textured view, we now have the text smashing out of the wall, creating that nice shape. So a couple things that you can do with this if you'd like. You can take a plane, rotate that 90 degrees on the X, move that up, maybe scale it, and you can make this whatever color you want, maybe like a glowing blue or something like that, and make the text colored, and play around with it a little bit. The only bad thing is that once you actually have the text, you can't go back and edit it. It's kind of stuck in place. So that's kind of a bummer, but there's still a lot of flexibility here. It's really fun to play with, and I encourage you to also check out my video on detailing fractures with particles if you want to add that little bit of extra realism to this and add a little bit of particles in there to kind of spice it up. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you next time.